We are now ready for a very special session once again with Vikram Seth in conversation with Samantak Das on the wealth of inspiration to be found in the East. Go East, young reader.
We all know Vikram Seth, the creator of a text which has given great joy to Amritanjan because of the sprained wrists that have resulted, and as a poet. But what not all of us know is that he started his career as an economist, though he didn't actually complete his degree at Stanford, and spent several years in China, in the villages of China before liberalization, between the Mao and the Deng Xiaoping periods. He's learned Chinese, so he has a much greater first-hand experience of the East than most of us do. And so I'd just like him to go back to the time, a bit of which you will have read in his marvelous adventure / travelogue called Through Heaven Lake, Travel Through Xinjiang and China. So Vikram, would you care to talk about why you got interested in China in the first place and learning Chinese and living there?
Sure. Is that on? Yeah, it is on. I find it, let's just a little further. Yeah, it's easier now. It's very difficult to talk in great proximity and then at the same time being addressed alone. And if they prefer your other profile, we can swap at half time.
He stays there or?
No, we'll change. Yeah. As far as China is concerned, you know, my first real sense of China was in this 1962 war, which gives you an idea of how old I am. I remember thinking, oh, you know, these strange people coming from the north and taking over our country. In other words, my first impression was of the Chinese being a kind of threat. And I suppose that lasted through much of my adolescence and so on. And it was only when I went to England and happened to be in a bookshop that I read, I picked a book up off the shelf. It was the poems of Wang Wei, the translations of this 8th century Chinese poet, a nature poet. He also wrote a lot about friendship. He was a great painter and a great calligrapher as well, though sadly none of his paintings and calligraphy survive. His poems, of course, do and have been translated. But I was very moved by these poems. I think of nothing like them in English literature or Hindi literature. And although they're nature poets, of course, we've got plenty of descriptions of nature in both Sanskrit and Hindi classics. And of course, in European literature, you can think of people like Wordsworth. But this was in a completely different mode. And I remember thinking to myself, if I'm so affected by these poems in translation, then I wonder what it would be like in the original. And many years later, in fact, after I had learned Chinese, I looked over the book of translations that had inspired me. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I could. I was less impressed by them then than after I'd read the poems, and I decided to translate them myself.
Yeah. And your first book, which was in fact published from Kolkata, called Mappings, has translations of 2 or 3 Chinese poems?
It is translation of one Chinese poem.
One
It's the Thoughts While Traveling at Night, not by Wang Wei, but by his contemporary Du Fu.
Whom you've translated subsequently in 3 Chinese poets and elsewhere.
Yeah.
Du Fu.
Du Fu, Li Bai, and Wang Wei were 3 contemporary poets in the 8th century, and they have a very different take on the world. Whereas Du Fu could be considered a sort of Confucian sage who thought that serving the state as a civil servant was the best thing he could do in life, and it was largely because he didn't advance in his career, luckily, rather like Chaucer, that we got the Canterbury Tales from Chaucer, and we got many of Du Fu's wonderful poems. Chaucer was also a bureaucrat, as you know. But Li Bai was one of these crazy kind of standard poets who roams around with flashing eyes and drinking a lot of wine. So he can be seen as a kind of Taoist sage, and or Taoist immortal. And then Wang Wei is seen as more Buddhistic in his attitude to life. So there's this quite standard Chinese trichotomy between the Taoists, the Buddhists, and the Confucian. And they all lived between, say, 700 and 770. 701 and 702 were the years of Wang Wei's and Li Bai's birth, and Du Fu was about 10 years later. And Du Fu died in 770.
But can I drag you
Sure.
1300 years and
unwillingly, but yes.
yes. And actually get you to talk about your economist self, as it were, because I think one of the most striking passages that you have in Heaven Lake, well, not just a striking passage, in several places he talks about, and remember this is the early 80s, he talks about how you've got two very large countries with large populations, great deal of poverty, and you say that, well, the Chinese have actually handled it better, and you're talking about traveling through one of the poorest regions of Tibet, and you say what struck you at that point is that there was no malnutrition, there were no children starving on the streets, everybody was more or less clothed and warm and so on and so forth. So I want your take, as not as a poet, not as somebody who's translating 8th century poetry, but as someone who's living in the here and now, to talk about your experiences of China and also why you've never been back after a certain time.
Well, I'll start with the last bit. I never went back to China after the incident of Tiananmen, where crowds of peaceful protesters were mowed down, and yes, I would say that it was in the aftermath of that event that I decided to translate these poets, because the time they lived in, China was undergoing a great civil war with a lot of death and a lot of destruction. One of Du Fu's sons died through starvation and separation. So it was, in a sense, consoling to know that in times of great sorrow and tragedy and suffering, these poems, which were written then, would also be able to comfort and console Chinese people living through difficult times now. And given the nature of the script, the Chinese script, these poems can still be read, whereas for us it might be quite difficult to read, say, even the poems, I don't know, of Surdas or of not Shakespeare, but say Chaucer. For the Chinese, because of the nature of the script, it continues to be readable, even if the pronunciation has changed. And indeed, some of the rhymes, although they've changed, have remained rhymes, because they've changed in parallel. But to address the question of how, as I traveled hitchhiking through Tibet, the permission for which I actually only got because I sang an Indian film song, Avara, which movie is very popular, or was very popular in China, one of only 4 Indian movies that was shown again and again. As I was traveling through Tibet and other parts of China, I did notice poverty, but I didn't notice the kind of immiseration that we had in India at that time. And I made generalizations, perhaps only partly as an economist, but just as a general traveler and as a citizen of my country, going through less visited parts of another country. I would say, though, that I did correct some aspects of this later, because at that time I was an economist and a demographer, and I was doing research in the Chinese villages. And some of the troubling stuff that I noticed was the excess number of deaths over a certain particular period that had happened in China, from say 1959 to 1962 or so. And of course, this was just on the basis of some village data, a few villages. But when the latest census in China, the first in 30 years, was published, it became very clear that there had been absolutely terrible famines in China during those years. Famines which were exacerbated by... Sorry, I thought... If at any point you can't hear me at the back, please shout, okay? Because it may be that inadvertently I've turned something off. These terrible famines had been exacerbated by official policy and by official lack of information. Not having a free press, having cadres who tried to please people at the center by reports of overproduction, more food was requisitioned from the villages and from the countryside and taken into the cities. And even some food was exported at a time when people were suffering from incredible deprivation. And the news was simply not getting out. It wasn't even getting out to the higher party, the middle-ranking party leaders, because everyone thought that they would lose their prerogatives as a sub-official if they reported underproduction. Now, this led to the death of between, if you can get your heads around this, 15 to 30 million people. So, perhaps my first description needed to be adjusted, and in fact, in a preface that I wrote to a later edition of From Heaven Lake, around the time of Tiananmen, in fact, I do mention this fact. But in the early 80s, we simply didn't know it. So there are good things, obviously, that China has done, and I'd say also, particularly in the question of health, for example.
Education.
Health, education, I would say simply in terms of longevity. But there are very serious problems, one of which, of course, is the environmental pollution, freedom of speech, and, of course, worst of all, but this won't happen in China now, I don't think, this terrible business of the famine that happened then.
Right.
Now, of course, the news will get out simply by social media, if nothing else.
Right, right. But if I can sort of try and come back to literature.
You took me away from literature.
I'll take you out and bring you back in, playing you like a fish on a line. But so, which when you say look east, there's not just the spatial component of looking east, but which time do you think one should look at? Contemporary things that are happening, because China has an enormous cultural influence which is growing day by day. I mean, half the stuff that we use is Chinese, the markets which have been blanked by Chinese stuff on the one hand.
But that doesn't mean a cultural influence.
Right.
That means it's got a huge economic
influence. Well, you can't separate the two, can you really? I mean,
yes and no, actually. Okay. Because it seems to me that though the Chinese are a very nationalistic people, they are also desperately keen to prove their modernity in Western terms, for example. Right. So, and one can also say you can't separate economics from politics. The Chinese seem to have managed to some extent to do that. Right. Enrichez-vous, but don't upset the balance of power. We've got the monopoly of power, the Communist Party of China has. Also in terms of law, there are more executions in China than in, I'd say, the rest of the world put together annually. On the other hand, you can say that in certain respects, for example, the decriminalization of homosexuality, China and Russia are far ahead of us. Right. We've just gone the other way around. So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. I mean, basically, law, politics, economics, freedom of speech. One cannot really say, oh, well, India's doing better or China's doing better. China might have a faster growth rate now, but they're building up a terrible amount of pollution. Absolutely. As well. And one doesn't know about this business of large dams. And of course, exactly, there you can just brutally tell people, get out. Yeah. Protests simply won't be put up with.
Right. No, but I was thinking, which China? So your 8th century China, is that what you're asking us to look at?
I'm not asking anyone to look at anything. Basically, it's not compulsory to look at China or to look at anything. I blundered or stumbled into it, and I did it out of curiosity and pleasure in the first instance. And only later did I feel that I'd learned a lot. And
what did you learn?
Well, I think basically many aspects of how individuality and humanity and art and literature can coexist with a brutal and repressive system, at least in the gaps, and how people try to struggle and make their lives with their families somehow the center of their world, while realizing that, serving the state or whatever it is a very dangerous a powerful occupation. That is why, for example, I would say that the great Cultural Revolution was such a terrible business, because there, the Chinese being very family-oriented people, their children were forced to denounce their parents, husbands were forced to denounce their wives, suicides were rife. It was a bitter and a cruel time. And I don't really know. I mean, it for them was a time that most people look back on with horror.
Horror, absolute horror, yeah. But something I've always wondered, because I think of you as one of the great formalists, because you pay such great attention to form. And you worked across a wide range of genres. I mean, there's poetry, the translations of poetry, there's the novel in verse, there's the novel story for children, and in every single instance, your libretti and the Revered Earth, in every single instance, what has struck me is the fact that you have been very true to the form. You've chosen a form, you've worked around it, you've never, and that's one of the reasons why I love your poetry, all you who sleep tonight, and so that wonderfully structured stuff. Was this in any way influenced by the Chinese, one might almost say, obsession with formal perfection, or?
Could be. I mean, my general point about form is this, that form without content or feeling is pointless. But, so really, I mean, I feel as a poet, I'm an emotional poet, basically. But I still feel, I mean, I definitely feel, that to just write something without structuring it neither satisfies me nor necessarily would mean much to anyone else. Aspects of meter and rhyme and other figures of speech do find a prominent place in my poetry, as in much of the poetry I admire. Now, that doesn't mean that I don't like someone like Whitman or many other poets who write in a much freer mode. It's just that it's not necessarily my particular style. Now, as to whether that came from my Chinese contact with Chinese literature, I would say not in the first instance, because I'd already been writing poetry before I went to China, and long before I went to China. But there were aspects of Chinese poetry which helped me concentrate a little more on it. I'll give you one example. All these three poets whom I've talked about, Wang Wei, Du Fu, and Li Bai, they wrote in a certain specific form, as common, in fact, more prevalent in China than, say, the sonnet form was in Western literature. It was an eight-line poem, eight-line form, where the second, fourth, sixth, and eighth lines rhyme. There are either 5 or 7 syllables in the entire poem. And there's a kind of grammatic parallelism between the third and fourth line, and again between the fifth and the sixth line. And then, in addition to that, they have a very complicated structure of tones. Now, you would think this is an impossible straitjacket. And yet, some of the most moving, I would say immortal poems in the Chinese language have been written in this form. And so I would say that taught me something about sort of not dancing in chains so much, but at least not being intimidated by these so-called constraints, and actually making the constraints a source of inspiration. Quite often a rhyme, for example, if a poem doesn't rhyme, you might not actually have let your mind go down a particular channel. And then it's suggested by the number of syllables or by writing poetry is a very curious business. And I suppose I began experimenting with the idea of writing some poems in words of a single syllable. For instance, I wrote a poem called Soon. It begins, I will die soon, I know, this thing is in my blood. And again, lately I've been writing...
Or this one, which is one of those eight-liners?
Yeah, sure. This is called an autumn meditation. This is not in words of one syllable. This is a translation of a poem by Du Fu. At the time when his country was racked by the civil war that I mentioned, and he's separated from the capital and so on. The capital was called Chang'an. An autumn meditation. I've heard it said Chang'an is like a chessboard where Failure and grief is all these 100 years have brought. Mansions of princes and high nobles have new lords. New officers are capped and robed for camp and court. North on the passes, gold drums thunder. To the west, horses and chariots rush, dispatches and reports. Dragon and fish are still, the autumn rivers cold. My ancient land and times of peace come to my thoughts. This was in 7 syllables originally, but there's a very short poem called Spring Scene in Time of War. Almost every Chinese person knows this poem. It begins, Guo Po Shan He Zai, 5 syllables. Country destroyed, mountain, river survive. Guo Po Shan He Zai. Spring Scene in Time of War. The state lies ruined. Hills and streams survive. Spring in the city. Grass and leaves now thrive. Moved by the times, the flowers shed their dew. The birds seem startled. They hate parting too. The steady beacon fires are 3 months old. A word from home is worth a ton of gold. I scratch my white hair, which has grown so thin, it soon won't let me stick my hat pin in. But in my own poetry too, I found that I quite often gravitated to this Chinese syllabic count aspect, and there's an entire section of this book which is in words of a single syllable. This is about the house that I'm staying in England. It's the house of a poet called George Herbert, who is a wonderful metaphysical poet. And he was a rector in a small church just next to it, and he acted in a sense as my host. When I was staying there, I had the feeling that I was inhabiting his rooms, his stanzas, so to speak. I just wonder if the people behind the screen, I'm not talking about the announcement, but I can hear a continuous sense of conversation.
Susurration, yeah.
Susurration.
Yes.
Susurration, a nice word. I can't speak because I'm hearing talk going on. I'm sorry, it's not distracting to you because you can hear me, but it's continuously in the background that's why you might have seen me looking a bit abstracted from time to time. Anyway. Host. So this is in a sense to George Herbert, but because it's all in words of single syllable, in a sense it's also a tribute to the 3 Chinese masters whom I talked about earlier. Host. I heard it was for sale and thought I'd go to see the old house where he lived 3 years and died. How could I know its stones, its trees, its air, the stream, the small church, the dark rain would say, "You've come, you've seen, now stay." A guest, I asked? Yes, as you are on earth. The means will come, don't fear. What of the risk? Our lives are that from birth. His ghost, his soul is here. He'll change my style. Well, but you could do worse than rent his rooms of verse. Joy came and grief, love came and loss, 3 years, tiles down, moles up, drought, flood. Though far in time and faith I share his tears, his hearth, his ground, his mud, yet my host stands just out of mind and sight, that I may sit and write.
See, that's justification enough for looking east. If you looked east and got this, I think that's...
Thank you. No, I really owe a lot to so many poets of the past. I don't think I would have written I wouldn't have written the Golden Gate, for example, if it hadn't been for a wonderful translation of Pushkin's poetry.
Charles Johnston's, yeah.
Charles Johnston's great in Johnston's luminous translation. Eugene Onegin, like champagne, its effervescence stirs my brain. And it's very nice to be able to thank him in the course of writing the poem. In fact, I did send Charles Johnston my book, not when it was published, but before it had been published. And he was very old at the time, and his wife had died recently, and he was he was a man beset by sorrow, and he really appreciated the fact that that the book was going to come out, and that it acknowledged him so fulsomely. But the sad thing was that when the book did come out, and almost every review of The Golden Gate mentioned Charles Johnston's excellent translation, by then he had died. And so that's the way it was. But the great thing about the past and poets beyond English literature, which we're mainly taught about, is that it's open as long as you can get a good translation and as long as you have the time and curiosity to go there. But quite apart from going east and west or north, young man, we don't even seem to go south.
Exactly.
In other words, to our own heritage in many ways. For example, I think, Samantak, you were saying to me that South Indian literature
basically didn't exist for me until until well into my 20s or something like that.
What happened then, and what?
Then I heard, I read some Ramanujan.
You read Ramanujan?
I read Ramanujan, and then I tried to access this. But that also brought me up against the problem, which is that of translation.
Yes.
If we had to go east or west or north or south or whatever.
Yeah.
And I ask you this because you're a practicing translator yourself, and how trustworthy are the translations that we have, let's say, of Chinese texts or Japanese texts or Indonesian texts? I mean, can we take them on in good faith? Because with South India, I mean, there are large overlaps, cultural overlaps. You can understand things.
Yes.
You can guess at things. But very often one is confronted with this enigma.
True, and some people try to make it even more enigmatic because they think, oh well, if you can cloak it in mist and mystery, then somehow it will become more attractive. This idea of orientalization, but even further east, so to speak. I suppose what one could do is hope that you have 2 or 3 different translations of the same text, and then you can sort of triangulate inwards into what it might be.
Which is what you did with the Johnston translation of Onegin, didn't it? You looked at another translation and
true.
realized that it wasn't...
Yeah, exactly. There were 2 translations in the Stanford bookstore, and both of them maintained Johnston's, or Pushkin's rather tight stanzaic form, the so-called Onegin sonnet, or stanza. But one of them was so clearly more colloquial, more feeling, more skilled than the other. You stopped noticing that you were reading a translation.
Right.
After a while, you stopped noticing that you were reading a poem at all. You were reading for the story and what happened to Tatyana and what happened to Onegin. Yeah. And it is a book which has a great deal of charm and a great deal of laughter and a great deal of sadness as well. Right. And I think there again, I think I learned from Pushkin that it's possible to move quite quickly between different registers without there being a perceptible hiatus.
Right. Let me try and sort of bring you back to form and another kind of form, which is the calligraphic form, because you've studied not just Chinese calligraphy but also Persian or
not
Arabic.
Persian, Arabic. Because
Arabic
the script that I studied was not Nastaliq, which of course we use here, but Thuluth, or Thuluth as we call it, which is quite often used for the ayats of the Quran.
Yeah. Does that in turn discipline your writing? Because you're actually talking of a completely different form.
Yes, indeed. I mean, actually, in Chinese calligraphy, for example, you don't use the pen or the qalam or whatever, an appropriate thing to say today, the qalam. But you use the brush. The brush has been used for writing, not just for painting, for writing, for thousands of years. And the fact that you use the same implement for art and for writing that the one seeps into the other in many regards. Now there are different, I mentioned 2 Arabic styles, but there are many different Chinese styles of writing as well, which I won't go into here. But quite apart from the different types of scholar script or standard script or whatever, or seal script, there are also different speeds and levels of cursiveness or connectivity, which means you might be able to do a piece of Chinese calligraphy extremely fast, and yet it would be informed or imbued with the knowledge and the study of, decades perhaps. The other thing that is very interesting about a piece of Chinese calligraphy is this. You can read it as literature, you can read it as art, and you can read it as music. Talking about bird song, you can read it as music. Now, you can understand the first 2 easily enough. After all, the words are there. It might be a poem or something. So you're reading it as poetry, as literature. You can understand reading it as art because you see the entire shape of it in black and white with a little bit of red where the seal is. But what do I mean by saying reading it as music? It's this. When you write in Chinese, every stroke is written in a certain order. And so when you read a piece by a famous, or see a piece by a famous calligrapher as opposed to a famous painter, you don't ask yourself, was the left eye painted before the right eye? Did he do the trees first and then the ducks in the foreground? None of those questions come into play. You know exactly in which order everything has been written down to the smallest stroke. And as a result, you can enter the calligrapher's mind. Why did he pause here? You can tell from the thickness of the ink. I'm sorry. I hope everyone has turned off their mobile phone, unlike me. Okay. So, I better turn it off because today being that... Yeah, the Judgment Day, yeah. So I'm getting... Quite appropriate that we're sitting near Victoria Memorial. I'm sorry? Yeah, well, yes, and yes. Victoria has a lot to answer for, or at least to make light of something that is too serious, actually. But where was it? Oh, yes, music. I'm sorry, I should have asked for a projector or something, but this is 2 lines, Feng Ho Lian San Yue. Yeah, the beacon fires connect 3 months. Yeah, and a letter from home would be worth 10,000 pieces of gold. And it's written on the original, you'd be able to see where the tip of the pen, tip of the brush went down to provide you with the bone, so to speak, and where it bled into the Chinese rice paper to give you this muscle. So you can't correct it. It's just done in a single movement, in a sense.
And this is by you, incidentally.
Well, yeah, I did that piece of calligraphy. But, I mean, I had to get permission from my teacher. I said to him, look, are you going to be embarrassed by this? So finally, when he found something that was satisfactory, he said, no, that will do.
Okay, so how many times do you have to do the same thing?
I would embarrass myself by telling you. But at any rate, so where did he pause? Why did he ink there? Why did he put this cluster of words together? So you're reading it through time. In other words, you're reading it diachronically, which is what I meant by music. It's being read as time passes. You can see exactly what he's doing, or imagine what he's doing. So it's an incredible, wonderful, complex form. At the same time, it's very spare. There are only 2 colors with a touch of red. So there it is. I mean, I must say, there was a time when I was spending more time, in fact, I'd say a year or so more, when I was spending more time doing Chinese calligraphy than anything else. Yeah. And so even though I haven't visited China after that dreadful massacre on the square, Chinese culture has formed a huge part of my life and has enriched my life immeasurably.
Right, so I think that is, again, to repeat myself, something, here's a living embodiment of why we should go east, and also south, and also north and west, but we should.
And maybe also inwards.
And maybe also inwards. But the sheer discipline, and the hard work that you have to put in and then make it appear effortless. I was reminded of this because, to my mind, you're the first sort of very well-known international figure, world citizen sort, Indian, who's been talking about going to China, looking to the east after Tagore, almost 100 years after him. In between, I cannot really think of people asking us to look to China, except for the Naxalites saying, go and read Mao's Red Book, which is trivial, in a sense. But why do you think this happened? Here's this huge civilization, right next door, with whom we've had encounters for millennia, and yet not much interest. Would you agree there hasn't been much interest? I can't recall any interest in my...
No, I must say, before you ask this question, it must surprise you, but I hadn't given the subject much thought, because as to why. I mean, I know that the Chinese came to us, Xuanzang, Faxi, and to mention only, and Buddhism and so on. I suppose we have got something from the Chinese, the civil service, but indirectly. The Chinese had a civil service 2,000 years ago, really, through competitive examinations for more than 1,500 years.
Yes. And Kolkata Chinese food, which is nothing like Chinese food. Calcutta Chinese telling me when we went to China, and we hated it there. And I said, why did you hate it? They don't know how to cook.
I see. Yeah, they don't cook Chinese food the way we like it. I see. Yeah. Well, but I don't really know. And actually, would you mind if I asked you why you think it is so?
I have no idea. I mean, Tagore, of course, was, a contrarian in many ways. Correct. He was saying, everybody's looking west, you look east. Everybody's sending their son to England to become a lawyer. He sends his son off to America to become a farmer. And so on and so forth. And maybe there's a bit of that spirit in you as well. But I just find it very interesting that no Indian with this sort of, voice, I mean, who's going to be heard on an international stage, is asking us to look east. If it is now, if we are now looking east, it's with fear and fear and loathing. The Chinese are going to take us over, that kind of thing.
I mean, as I said, the fear, loathing, and ignorance, I think, was stronger after the Sino-Indian conflict.
62 years.
62. I think, and particularly after the Hindi-Chinese bye-bye, we have a lot to answer for in that conflict, as well as they. And as I said, the 59 to 61 famine might have been one reason why they were looking for an external adventure, so to speak. But, I mean, if you actually read the correspondence, I mean, we were ridiculously complacent and also fairly arrogant. And of course, they also are very not xenophobic partly, but also very nationalistic. So it was something bound to happen unless a compromise of some sort was made. Now it's interesting that the two countries are basically saying, look, let's just get on with other subjects and leave this thing for a while. When we trust each other sufficiently, something will happen and we'll hopefully sort it out. But each of us is looking in a fairly realistic and beady-eyed manner at the other, militarily.
Which you think is a good thing?
Well, I think, you have to guard your borders, absolutely.
So you're not a pacifist. I mean, you've written against, you haven't been to China after Tiananmen. You've written against the Iraq war, but would you call yourself a pacifist?
Well, mowing down your citizenry is not a war. It's just brutality of the worst nature. Oh, sorry. With the Iraq war, actually, funnily enough, I was in England at the time, and I actually protested. Now, I don't think that it's right necessarily to go to someone else's country and start telling them what their policies should be. But in this case, it was so clearly against even British interests, quite apart from the question.
You mean the Iraq thing?
Yeah, the Iraq war. Yeah. Sorry, did I say that? Oh, no, I may not have made that clear. It was so clear that I thought I would protest and speak out and also, go on this kind of march through Hyde Park. There's no excuse for that war, I don't think. Basically, the country and America and so on were misled into that war. And it led to several 100,000 deaths. I'm talking about Iraqi deaths, quite apart from other deaths, So I think when I was writing, I don't think that I'd abjure every war. I think that, I'm not a Gandhian pacifist in that sense. But I certainly think that certain wars are simply, by their nature, unjust. And as a result, the suffering that is invariably occasioned by war has to be seen as a form of culpable homicide. If you create a war when you know that people are going to die, and you create it in a spirit of adventurism. Yes.
Okay, I think there are people in the audience. I know there are people in the audience who are dying to ask you questions. So maybe we can take a
Absolutely.
few questions from them and...
And maybe should I just finish off? I'll finish off with the Chinese beastly tale.
Okay.
Okay. So, at least I can see the audience, which is nice. During my previous session, unfortunately, it was dark, so I could just barely make people out. So, if once you get the mic, if you just stand up, that would be great. Please, please.
Shall I ask my question now, or?
Ask now. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, no, this is actually tying up with what you had said 2 days ago when you're talking about Section 377. So I'd like to bring those two conversations, 2 days ago and today's. I'm talking particularly about Chinese queer literature, and I'm talking particularly about, say, the whole culture of the Tongxi comrade.
Tongzhi.
Tongzhi, right, thank you. And also about the tales of the cut sleeve, which is a big tradition of sort of male love in Chinese literature and in Chinese culture. Considering you've got such well-developed interests in Chinese literature and culture, have you ever considered sort of translating Tales of the Cut Sleeve into English, if it's possible?
Actually, when I translate, I mean, I've sort of dragged into translation against my own muse, so to speak, who tells me, hey, you should go and write your own stuff. But the Duan Xiu, or the cut sleeve, comes from a story of an emperor who had, male concubines as well as female ones, and his favorite, or maybe that emperor only had male concubines, or friends, or whatever you'd call them, and the emperor had to perform his duties, but his friend was asleep on the rather large sleeves of the imperial cloak. And rather than wake him up, the emperor cut the sleeve so that he wouldn't disturb his sleeping friend, and then went to do his duties. So as a kind of euphemism, the Chinese have often said, rather than saying Tong Xing Lianai, rather than saying the same-sex attraction, they sometimes just say the cut sleeve, and people understand what they mean. Or Tongzhi, which means of the same mind or mentality or same intention, let's say. But yes, I mean, many Chinese emperors. Well, for example, even here, Ranjit Singh, for example, apart from his wife, he also had a number of male as well as female concubines. And so, this whole business of, and many, I mean, Frederick the Great of Germany, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, the idea that, that this thing is sort of restricted to some countries and is not found in other countries, it's a human thing. And God knows, I mean, it's going to continue to be a human thing regardless of what strictures come down from on high.
or judgments from Supreme Courts.
That was a way of saying it. So I would say, as far as translating it is concerned, I haven't. And on the whole, I tend to translate poetry more than prose. But I'm sure there are excellent translations. Where did you read this translation? You haven't read the translation. I'm sure there are some. There must be some in English. Yeah. Okay, sorry, you can't hear at the back. I'll just repeat. The gentleman said he's only read essays about them. But yeah, it is something that. Why didn't you learn Chinese, young man? I'm just kidding. No, it's not that. What I meant is in order to translate it. Fine. Well, thank you for tying the two together. It's a very, very interesting point indeed.
This might just jog your memory a little bit.
Sorry, where are you?
Left.
Oh, right. The lady in pink.
This might jog your memory a little bit, Vikram, but I want to bring you back to what you'd said about home. And I think a lot of people might be interested, considering you're a global figure of great renown. You speak about you've come, you've seen, now stay, just now, and then a word from home is
worth a ton of gold.
Yes.
Yes.
As a global poet, way back in Singapore when you were visiting, I remember interviewing you and covering the wonderful libretto you'd written, Arian and the Dolphin. And you'd been asked a question about what you felt about home. And you gave, in your characteristic manner, you had said, home is not necessarily a place where they want you to stay.
Oh, no, no, I'm sorry. I filched that from Robert Frost.
Yes, I know.
Robert Frost said, home is the place where if you have to go, they have to let you in.
Yes, but...
It's another... sorry, but I didn't mean to interrupt, but could we make a question, perhaps?
Yes, the question to you is, so what does home mean to you as a diasporic, or how do you see yourself?
Well, the Chinese have a word for this. They call them Hua Qiao, which is like overseas Chinese. And it's a very, very... it's a disyllabic phrase. We have only, to some extent, lately realized, what you could call the Hua Yin, or the overseas Indian, as a kind of community, or, all this Pravasi stuff that's happening. But the Chinese, for example, have this lovely poem, which every Chinese person knows about, resting your head and looking up at the moon and looking down and thinking of home. I did write a poem once called Homeless. But at that time I didn't think I'd have any money to have a home of my own. And that poem perhaps will answer your question in a kind of way. I'm not sure I'll remember it right, and I expect anyone who has been forced to read me for school will correct me, but here it is. Homeless. I envy those who have a house of their own, who can say their feet rest on what is theirs alone, who do not live in sufferance, in strangers' shells, as my family has all my life, and as I probably will. A place on the earth, untenured, grass, brick, trees, air, to know I will never have to move, to review the seasons from one lair, when night comes, to lie down at peace, to know that I shall die where I have slept, that things will not revert to a stranger's hand, that those I love may keep what I have kept. By the way, there was a misquotation there, but I don't know quite the order of grass, trees, and air. Yeah. Should we just, I think, could someone stand with the mic right at the back as well? Otherwise, the people at the back will never get to answer questions.
So this young gentleman...
Yeah. I'll take your questions first, and then I'll take a couple of questions right at the back. Yes?
We can't hear you, I'm sorry. Take this.
Okay. Yeah, we can share a mic, and then, yeah.
So,
sure.
What influences your poetry? Is there anything particular that you're influenced by?
Well, love and lust and life. I don't know. I mean, basically, whatever interests me, in a funny way, whatever grabs my attention or the attention of my muse. It could be something very personal, or it could be something very political. Say, I've written about Tiananmen, or the killing of Steve Biko, or many other political subjects as well. Or it could be something in nature. I mean, one of the great things about poetry is that it's short, or usually short, and so it can build on the impulse of a moment. Whereas if you write a novel, then, of course, there are periods when you may not be fully engaged in your subject, but you're just continuing to write, hoping that later you can revise out the bits that don't work. With poetry, I think quite often there is this aspect of an intense, or sometimes it's very an odd juxtaposition. For example, sitting under in the shadow of Queen Victoria's building and in the shadow of her laws, for example. That's an interesting subject in its own right. So it could be anything, really, that moves one, or that makes one amused, or angry, or happy, or provides food for thought. Now, right at the very back, please. Yes. Meanwhile, while the mic travels to you, I'll answer your question. Yes.
Sir,
Please take a mic to the gentleman at the back. Thank you.
From Heaven's Lake has some ethereally beautiful passages. So, in contrast to that, there is a book by Perlis Buck, The Good Earth, which is also about famine in China. But it is so practical. It's just about it's lucid language. It's everyday. It consists of everyday language. So, what would you say? You were an economist yourself. Perlis Buck was a doctor. She saw the suffering of the people directly.
Right.
So, what would you say were the differences between you and Perlis Buck?
Well, you've mentioned some already. Well, I just think one of the good things. Look, let me answer this not in an evasive way, but just a part of my general philosophy of literature is that it's different strokes for different folks. She could no more write like me than I could like her. You've got to be yourself, basically. You can't just, contort your feelings as a writer or your feelings as a human being to please an idea of what good writing is like or what correct behavior or deportment is like. So I would also say that it's great that there are people who write in different styles, even about the same subject. Now take Jane Austen. She was writing in the middle of the Napoleonic Wars. But other than the so-and-so regiment being, billeted at in Blankshire, there's not much about it. And yet other people were writing about the nitty-gritty of that war. Similarly, when people say, oh, Indian literature in English even, a completely narrow field, why are you so different one from another? Why is someone writing magic realism, someone writing... Well, it's all to the good that people write in different styles and in different ways, even about the same part of the world. So all I'm saying is, I can't explain why I don't write in her style, but I'm glad I don't, and I can't explain why she doesn't write in mine, but I'm even gladder that she doesn't.
Or didn't. We've been warned that we have 5 minutes, so we'll take a couple more questions before you do your final reading. Yeah.
Hi Vikram, as a fan of yours from one's early youth, I've always wondered what your take is on the Nobel. I consider you're a truly cross-cultural, in my eyes, well, there are a lot of complex issues here, but nonetheless, just your take on the Nobel,
Well, you're talking about the Nobel Prize for Economics, aren't you?
Yeah, well, sure.
Well, listen, eventually you've got to realize that many things in life are decided by committees, right? Or by groups of people who make decisions which can affect, in some cases, the lives of tens of millions of people, decided in a matter of half an hour. Or not very important subjects like who gets some prize or the other. The Nobel, I can understand. Let's look at what's happened. Many good books and good writers haven't got it. Many good writers have got it. Many bad writers haven't got it, and many bad writers have got it. So, really, even the most noteworthy of prizes have to be taken for what they are. They are prizes. They're not anything more than that. And what really matters, let's put it this way, is not prizes, not even good reviews necessarily, not even sales of, however many thousands of copies you want to sell. After all, my poetry doesn't sell that many copies, and I love writing it as much as I like writing prose, in fact, in some ways even more. What really matters is this, that writing is a very private process, and reading is a very private process. And more than all of this stuff, in fact, more even than, I should say, without trying to sound, graceless or ungracious, more even than sort of meeting the author, etc., is this. Writing by yourself alone in a room, and some months later, or some years later, or even after you're dead, someone saying, look to her mother, look, Mama, please keep dinner for me. I know it's getting cold, but look, I'm reading this book. Don't disturb me. And one of the nicest compliments that was paid to me by a friend was this. I went in to call him out to do something, and he got really angry. He said, I'm reading. So I looked, and I saw that he was reading me. And I got rather cross, but then I thought, he couldn't have paid me a greater compliment. That's what matters more than prizes.
You've been waiting for a while yet. last question, I think.
Good afternoon, sir. It's a pleasure to be here today.
It's nice to be addressed as sir by two people. Shar. Fine.
Sir, I have one observation to make regarding the ending of...
No, no, I'm sorry. Are you going to talk about a suitable boy?
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry. Please do not give the ending away.
No, I won't, absolutely no. So I've been wondering how do I tell you my observation. I can't say that in front of you.
Quite so.
So how do we deal with this problem?
We don't. The answer is to you read the sequel. Of course, I've got to write it first.
But sir, please, I must tell you this. I've been...
Okay, do tell me, but please bear in mind the fact, A, that Lata, you know, quite apart from her wedding in whom she married, if she married anyone at all, which we don't know, she's lived 60 years since then, and she's had a married life. Happy, unhappy, or whatever, we don't know, okay? So, do bear that in mind. Secondly, bear my feelings as a writer. And remember that I wrote the book, but I also wrote about people who have independent thoughts and minds of their own. So it wasn't entirely my decision. And thirdly, please bear in mind the audience, many of whom have not read the book. So do ask the question.
I can derive inspiration from her in the next book. I'm facing
Oh
the
dear.
exact dilemma as Lata is.
Yes.
And I really draw inspiration from my character.
Well, listen, I said earlier that you've got to be yourself. And Lata had to be herself, given whatever her experiences were, her thoughts were. But in your case, just don't go by fiction, okay? Do what you have to do.
But then you should
Be
speak
brave.
to my father.
Is your father
He's
in the
not
audience?
there. You should talk to him.
Well, when you come up to me, bringing your book perhaps, or even bringing a piece of paper, I write him a very severe note.
I have everything with me. I have paper, I have a pen. You must write something for me, please.
Right, that's the next half hour.
Right,
gone.
I don't know how
But,
much weight my words will carry.
But
Now-
I'll have to call this session to a close. I know, because someone is making furious signals from the sidelines. And so we'll have Vikram, Vikram, I should call you Vikram in Kolkata, na?
Amader Bikram.
Amader Vikram, Porbe. ঠিক.
And I was born in the Elgin nursing home at 1:52 in the afternoon. So, I mean, I don't know what that means in terms of my Janapatri or whatever, but still, it seems to, whenever I come here, I feel happy, frankly.
Good,
now.
good,
Yeah.
good. আমাদের বিক্রমের শেষ কথা মানে for the moment.
Yeah. Actually, talk about I should also mention that not only Katha, it's also Kavita. What happened was my mother was having, when she was pregnant, a friend of hers was reading Rabindranath Thakur's Sheshir Kavita. And the rather wimpy hero, Amit, she was so taken by him that she decided that if it was a girl, it would be Amita, and if it's a boy, it's Amit. So, in fact, in the Elgin Nursing Home birth certificate, my name is Amit Seth. And it was only my father's side of the family which vetoed it. So it's cut out in pencil, and Vikram is written because Vijay was the eldest son's first son. The second son's first son was Vinod. Vijay, and so they decided it had to begin with a V. Luckily, it wasn't Vinash or Vikrit. But anyway, let's see. It could have been, Vineet or something else. Luckily, it was Vikram. So there it is.
Yeah.
Look, this is The Rat and the Ox. Beastly Tales consists of 10 poems. 2 from the Panchtantra, so that's India. 2 from Chinese tales. 2 from Aesop's Fable, so that's Greece. 2 from tales from Ukraine. And then there are 2 I wrote myself, The Elephant and the Tragopan, based on a kind of northeastern Zuku Valley, Nagaland ecological event. And one based upon the idea of art and literature and music, The Frog and the Nightingale. So what I'll read is The Rat and the Ox. Because the Chinese, as you know, have rat ears, tiger ears, dragon and so on. I, by the way, am a dragon, therefore very auspicious. The Rat and the Ox. And what it is, well, anyway. So the order of the zodiac matters very much. Who is top rat or top ox or whatever, top, yeah. Once the Chinese zodiac wandered slightly off its track, and a scholar deity was assigned to go and see what the good what the gods could do about it, for they couldn't do without it. Since the zodiac had swerved, everything had topsy-turved. All the years had gone awry, springs were cold and monsoons dry. Bears came out of hibernation in midwinter with elation. Then they saw the sky and scowled, shook their frozen fists and growled. Rabbits raged and voles grew vicious. All these signs were inauspicious, and the gods were much resented by a world so discontented. So the deity descended, and until his task was ended, workaholically obsessed, he took neither food nor rest, but with undiminished vigor questioned every fact and figure, size of sunspots, times of tides, weights of whitefish, and besides cross-examined train commuters, crunched the data in computers, tested truths, refuted guesses, curved his T's and crossed his S's, asked the planets piercing questions, took down sensible suggestions, went to the original sources, studied all impinging forces, multiplied his calculations, grilled the sages of 6 nations, and to the celestial court made this interim report after 33 years. Gods and godlings, it appears that the 12-year zodiac will resume its former track if we hasten to assign guards to make it toe the line. Guards? What kind of guards? My lords, if I may, you mean with swords? Not exactly. Well, what then? Who precisely are these men? Well, my lords, not men. Then what? Here's the list of guards I've got. When the gods looked down the list, they hired a psychiatrist. Only when he said he'd found that the godlings' brains were sound, did they read the list once more. Rabbit, monkey, tiger, boar, dog, sheep, dragon, ox, cock, snake, horse, and rat. There's some mistake. You've made a fool of us. This is quite ridiculous. It's an interim report, came the godling's mild retort. If you quash my findings, I could make a second try. But it might take 5 and 50. No, the gods cried, somewhat swiftly. No, 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 we're sure you're right. Sorry we were impolite. Please, please, please don't be offended. Do what you have recommended. Yes, 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 we do endorse it. And when final, we'll enforce it. When the godling went again to the world of beasts and men, he assigned, then tried to steer each beast to his proper year. Several animals objected to the years that he'd selected. Sheep and dog, for instance, hated to be harshly separated, and the boar, assigned the rear, threatened to boycott his year. Both the tiger and the rabbit felt the other should inhabit distant regions, and the sheep silently began to weep. Why he wept was never clear, so it can't be stated here. While the snake and dragon hissed, we can never coexist. Why is he my next-door neighbor? But at last, with love and labor, pleas and patience, they agreed to accept the pressing need to control the zodiac and bring peace and order back. Only one refused, and that selfish creature was the rat. Now, the rat was always reckoned difficult, and so the second year had been assigned to him, though in fact his claims were rather dim to the quite unprecedented honor that this represented. But the rat was far from grateful, and he screamed in accents hateful, "Are you trying to ignore me? Why has this ox been placed before me? Equity has been denied, merit has been thrust aside. Justice, faith, and truth have gone." On he screamed, and on and on. Though the scholar godling tried, he would not be mollified. If the ox is great, I'm greater. Ask a neutral mediator. If the ox is big, I'm bigger. Nonsense, groaned the ox. Your figure is as tiny as a tit. Ask the deity, you twit. But the rat screamed, I refuse. For his biased, spiteful views, I don't give a flying fig. Ask the public who is big. Put it to a public test. Then we'll see who comes off best. To diffuse this first-class row, and since he was anyhow sure to win, the ox complied, and the press was notified. Then the rat feigned gloom and grief. One night, creeping like a thief Snivelling to the ox he came, and he wept, "I'll die of shame. How can I face public scorn? Oh, why was I ever born? Look at my pathetic figure. If I were a little bigger, just a little bigger, I would not wish to shrink and die. I know you deserve first place. Save me from my just disgrace." Now the ox felt rather sad. "Cheer up, rat. Don't feel so bad. Even if your size were doubled, I would still be quite untroubled. You don't mind?" "Not in the least. I am much the bigger beast. Ask the godling for permission. I will second your petition." "Well, I'll do as you bid," said the smirking rat, and did. Soon he'd grown to twice his size, from his ankles to his eyes, and on the appointed day, ox and rat went on their way, wandering jointly through the town. Women threw their baskets down, screaming, "Oh my God, that rat! Nothing quite as big as that have I seen or ever will. Just to see it makes me ill." Nonetheless, they crowded round, and a shocked and rattled sound emanated from the horde, while the ox was quite ignored. Though they wandered side by side, everywhere the people cried, "What a beast! How huge! How massive!" Then the ox, so far impassive, thought the people had gone blind or that he had lost his mind. "Am I all that small?" he said to the dog, who shook his head. "No, I wouldn't say you're small, or the tiger, not at all, or the horse, or sheep, or pig, but that rat, he's really big." That is how the ox lost face, sinking down to second place in the zodiac, while the worst beast of all is still the first.
And thank you very much. We've run out of time, so thank you for being a wonderful audience. And on behalf of the audience, thank you, Vikram, for letting us a little bit into your mind and heart, I hope.
And I'll write that letter now to your dad. Are you carrying a suitable bag? It is a suitable bag.